Hello, thank you for joining us for this session, the IECC Process Explained, a Guide for Voters. I am Connie Empress, Communications Manager here at New Buildings Institute. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping things to tell you about. First, you are muted and we cannot hear you. This helps keep the background noise down so that everyone can better hear the speakers. I want to direct you to the dashboard that you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. If you are having technical difficulties and cannot see the slides or hear our speakers, you can use the question pane in this dashboard to let us know, and we will help you as we go. Please ask questions in the same question pane as they come up. We will take questions at the end of the presentation. At the end of this session, you will be given the opportunity to take a short survey. You will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with links to the recording and slides for this session. Our speakers today are Amy Cortez, NBI Director of Programs, and Eric Makala, NBI Director of Codes. Amy has been involved in sustainable design consulting and implementation of energy efficiency market transformation approaches for over 20 years. She is responsible for managing implementation teams covering all aspects of NBI's work. Eric has over 30 years of building energy codes expertise throughout the United States as well as abroad. He supports NBI's broader engagement in code development with an emphasis on stretch codes and multifamily code adoption. Amy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Connie, and thanks everybody for joining us. We're happy to have you here today to learn a little bit more about the 2021 IECC process. So for those of you who may not be familiar, NBI is a national nonprofit organization, and we research and define best practices in building energy efficiency and carbon emission reductions. NBI takes leading edge practices for high performance buildings and translates them into innovative and practical solutions for the building sector. Since NBI was founded more than 20 years ago, we've been deeply involved in energy code development and implementation across the United States. Today, we really want to provide you an overview of the energy code process, explaining why energy codes are an important tool in the toolbox for local governments. Many of you may be new to energy codes, and some may be overwhelmed with what is fairly complicated process. But in this webinar, we're going to try to take a step back and stay on the shallow side of codes, focusing on what we think you need to know regarding some of the top proposals in the 2021 International Energy Conservation Code. And finally, we want to make sure you know about important resources that are available to you to assist in voting. Those of you who are validated as governmental member voting representatives are really the unsung heroes of the climate crisis. We're so excited that you're here with us today. As voters, you have a really unique opportunity to influence how buildings will use energy and how renewables and electric vehicles will be integrated into the built environment. This is super important because buildings account for over 2 billion metric tons of carbon equivalent emissions each year. This represents 40% of the total carbon emissions and 70% of all electricity in the United States. And you all are the ones who will have a chance to influence this going forward. Energy codes are a really important tool for local governments to address carbon emissions, affordability, and to protect the health and citizens in their communities. Energy codes result in lower utility costs for owners and tenants, less energy wasted, and fewer emissions. Energy codes also result in healthier homes and buildings with better indoor air quality, and they directly address the long-term affordability and the ongoing energy burden of vulnerable and frontline communities. Another benefit of advancing codes is that they provide a guiding star for the market, encouraging manufacturers to produce and stock more efficient equipment and establishing best practices for workforce training programs. The bottom line is energy codes define the worst a building can perform. They establish minimum performance standards for all residential and commercial buildings at the time of construction or major renovation. Influencing decisions at this time is critical because many of these features will remain with that building over its entire life. Energy codes are set at the state level through legislative action or by regulatory agencies who've been granted this authority by the legislature. Separate codes exist for residential buildings and for commercial buildings. And some states mandate local governments cannot go beyond the state code minimums, while home rule states allow local governments to set their own energy code. While the United States doesn't have a federal energy code, there are two organizations, the International Codes Council and ASHRAE, that create national model energy codes and standards. ASHRAE creates standards through an ANSI consensus process among selected committees of representatives, industry representatives, and advocates. While the IECC also has a consensus vote, but this vote only involves the validated governmental member voting representatives, like many of you. Model energy codes are updated every 3 years. This chart shows how codes advance over time. Ideally, what we want to do is stay on this trajectory line to 0. And what we'd like to see is steady progress on energy codes that reflect the latest practices in design and construction. And this, we want to see incremental improvements every 3 years. What we don't want to do is wait until that last code cycle before 2030 to make big changes, because that would be very disrupting for the market. So this code cycle, we feel like we can achieve between 10 and 15% energy code improvement in residential and commercial energy codes, which would put us right about there where you see that 2021 IECC dot. You'll notice it's still above that line, but we're also going to talk about some tools and mechanisms that we're proposing in the code that are going to help jurisdictions get closer to that trajectory line and stay on track towards their goals. Important thing to note is that all energy codes provide a starting place for jurisdictions to use in their own code process. States and cities might adopt IECC for residential and ASHRAE for commercial, or they might cross-reference both. But people in states that don't explicitly use the IECC wonder why this vote is important or whether they should still participate. And we are here to tell you that even in that case, your vote is really important. The reality is all codes, whether they're published by IECC, ASHRAE, or state government, all these codes build in advance on each other. Ideas that work in one are often transferred to another within a short time frame. So even in places like California that already has a strong energy code, it will also benefit from a stronger IECC because this broadens the market for more efficient equipment and reduces costs for everyone. The 2021 IECC update is a year-long process. It began in January when 550 separate code change proposals were submitted to the IECC. Each one of these was heard at the committee action hearings in Albuquerque, New Mexico in April. Then there was a public comment period where modifications that amend the proposals were formally published. Over 300 public comments were heard at the final action hearings last week in Las Vegas. Electric voting is next, but the dates are still tentative. Originally, it was set for November 13th through the 27th, but we suspect that that is going to be delayed, and we've heard that the voting is scheduled to begin on November 18th. But we do encourage you to check out the ICC website for finalization, and we'll be sure to link those that are on our mailing list with information as it becomes available. Another important thing to note on this timeline is that ICC recommends that all the validated governmental member voting representatives check their password and security questions before voting begins. It will be important for all GMVRs to know their unique PIN number. This PIN is required to submit as you're voting. So we really encourage all of the validated voters to log in now, sooner rather than later, and check your password, username, and make sure you know your PIN. That way, when all the voters in a particular jurisdiction get together and have a pizza party to encourage everybody to vote, instead of spending time frustrated trying to figure out how to log into the system, you'll be ready to actually get started with the voting. So unless you're familiar with it, and to some extent, even if you're not familiar with the voting, the IECC voting process can be confusing. It all happens on a system called CDP Access. And CDP Access is available to all of the governmental member voting representatives. So how it works is that validated voters can either support or disapprove the standing motion that came out of the hearings in Vegas. So that motion might be the proposal as it was submitted, or the proposal as it was modified by the committee, or the proposal as it was modified by the public comment number, or the proposal that had been disapproved. And sometimes this voting is counterintuitive. So for example, not to get into the weeds here, but if the committee disapproved an efficiency measure, and that's the standing motion, what we might actually do is encourage you to oppose the disapproval, which would actually be voting in favor of efficiency. So like I said, it's confusing, and to some extent, we're going to ask that you trust us on how to vote. And in fact, our voting guide is going to be delayed a couple days in getting out, because we want to be crystal clear that we are providing the most accurate information. And we will certainly link everyone to the voting guides as the minute that they're available. So it really takes a collaborative effort by a number of organizations to influence and encourage updates to the code. NBI has been working with organizations like the Northwest Codes Group and the National Energy Efficient Codes Coalition, which includes a wide variety of groups, including Natural Resources Defense Council, Institute for Market Transformation, Affordable Housing Advocates, and a whole group of technical people on these top proposals. And we're all working together to publish a voter's guide to help focus your attention on what we think are the highest priority proposals. And we really want to recognize all of these groups and all the effort and time that's gone into it, and it is much appreciated. And like I said, it is a collaborative effort. And today we don't have time to go through the entire list of proposals that you'll see on the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition list, but we can say that if it's on the list, we think it's worth your time to vote for it. Okay, so without going to all of them, what we decided to do is bucket them into 3 general categories that we're calling flexibility for the future, which is looking into some modification on how the code works in order to provide flexibility and a tool for jurisdictions. Then we'll go into some general efficiency proposals that deal with building characteristics like the building envelope, building mechanical systems, lighting systems, whatnot. And then finally, we'll talk about electrification in codes and talk about proposals that make jurisdictions ready and resilient and renewable. So the first category is called flexibility for the future. So it's becoming really clear that as codes get better and better, not all solutions are working for all buildings. And so that's why we're proposing some new ideas that change the way the code works on both the commercial and residential side. And on commercial, these are called points options that refer to what's called the Section C406 points option tables, which I'll get into. And in residential, this flexibility are called flex points. All right, so I'm going to spend a little time talking about each one of these. On the commercial side, a number of code cycles ago, Section C406 added options, and the idea was to provide flexibility for the teams, the builders, to choose whichever one of these options they thought made most sense for their building. So it was Section C406 required pick one among a list of many. However, it has become very clear, and energy modeling analyses by Pacific Northwest National Labs has found significant differences in the energy savings potential for each one of these 8 options. So not only do the savings vary from one option to the other, but the savings also vary depending on where you're located. It might be different in Maine and Texas, or it might be different on what type of building you are. You know, commercial has a lot of different building types that are in there. Office buildings, mercantile buildings, other types of buildings. So what happens is the way Section C406 is written now, there's significant inconsistency across the options, across the location, and across the building type. So proposal CE 218 aims to remedy these shortcomings in Section C406. All right, so by including multiple options that might be highly effective in some situations, but not in others, the code can offer this increasing energy efficiency and provide flexibility for builders to choose their own path to efficiency, whatever works best for their project. The points option promotes flexibility and choice. And what it does is it rewards savings measures appropriate to the type and location of the building. So CE 218 is the base proposal that converts Section C406 from a pick any one approach to achieve 10 points, where each point represents 0.25% or 0.25% of annual building energy savings, energy cost. So in other words, 10 points represents about 2.5% cost savings for energy. The points for each of the options are based on modeling analysis across all climate zones and for various occupancy types. Lookup tables by occupancy type show the number of points by option and by climate zone. Okay, so I'm going to show an example. And for those of you who may not be familiar, I have a map of the climate zone. So the United States has a variety of different climate zones. So they're all numbered. And as you look at this table, going across the top row are all the different climate zones. Down the left are all the different options and sub-options. Okay, so the way the lookup tables work are, first, you want to find the appropriate occupancy. So group M are mercantile occupancy. So this is for a retail type building. All right, so now we have the right table. What we want to do is say, okay, which one of these measures are we interested in doing? Well, this is an improvement in lighting power allowance, right? So by improving the lighting, and in our climate zone happen to be in 4C, and we look on the lookup table to find 14 points, right? So we only need 10 points. So this one option, if that was selected by the builders, would be enough to achieve the 10 points that would be required under Section C406, under the CE 218 proposal. All right, another example, because there are some that don't add up, but how that might work, say same occupancy, this time we're in a different climate zone. And so if there was the 5% better than heating option, you'd have to look in that column for something that would equal up to 10 points. So it might be renewables would be an option that you could use, and that would get your 10 points. So those are just some examples to help people get familiar with how the tables work. They're a little bit intimidating to look at, but once you get into it, it's really pretty straightforward as long as you look for your particular occupancy and your climate zone. And then you get a lot of flexibility. So this provides builders the opportunity to pick whichever measures make most sense for their particular building. So that's how it works in the commercial side. So this is the points option tables under CE 218. The other thing is another way this adds flexibility is that it's an easy mechanism to add new options. And so there are two options that we hope you'll consider. CE 226, which is lighting in multifamily buildings, and CE 240, which is kitchen equipment, which will obviously be of interest for restaurant type occupancies. So overall, we're asking that you support CE 218, CE 226, and CE 240 as more options. The other thing is that jurisdictions could use this as a tool, if they're interested in more aggressive efficiency instead of 10 points. It has kind of an inherent structure that jurisdictions can ask for even more points. So maybe they want to do 12 points or 15 points. So the CE 218 proposal really provides a structure and an effective tool for jurisdictions to be able to help improve efficiency within their jurisdiction. On the residential side, like I said, it's called flex points there. And here, each point represents about 1% savings. So 5 points is what's required under RE 209. And that represents about 5% savings. So this is the flex points. This is a flex points option that we think is important to highlight. The one thing that's a little bit different about this one is that the points tables are based on pre-packages of measures. So not just individual measures like you saw before, like either lighting or heating. Here, there'll be packages of measures like envelope measures, equipment efficiency, and Energy Star appliances that all get kind of bundled into a package. And that's what the tables represent. So same concept, same opportunity to provide flexibility for the design teams and for jurisdictions, but this is RE 209 is the proposal that is going to get there on the residential side. All right, so now I'm going to, and if you have any questions, I'll take a pause here and remind people to please use the chat box. If you do have questions or if you didn't quite understand the explanation, let us know and we'll try to get those at the end. So, all right, with that, I'm going to pass it off to Eric to talk about some of the rest of the proposals.
Great, thanks, Amy. So we, last week, I guess it was last week, I've kind of lost track of time. We spent about 5 days and I'm estimating about 50 hours of listening to proposals to increase efficiency on both the commercial and residential energy code, and also some proposals actually would try to kind of turn things back. And I'm going to focus on the proposals that would actually move us forward in efficiency. Lots of stakeholders in Las Vegas representing all aspects of industry. We had the construction architects, code officials, so a very broad spectrum. And it was a good discussion on the code floor, but I think a lot of good things came out of this, and you'll have the opportunity, as Amy had said, to vote on a lot of the efficiency gains that we're going to be coming out of this. I kind of want to lay a little bit of the context. I'm going to talk briefly about what happened on the commercial and the proposals there we want to look at, and also on the residential. And on the commercial side, when you start looking at commercial energy efficiency, you want to focus on making sure that the building shell itself is built properly. And because you only do that one time, so you want to make sure you get the efficiencies in there that you need. You want to make sure you have a good efficient mechanical system and the controls that go along with that. Lighting is an important aspect of commercial energy, as is water heating. And then the one thing we're starting to focus on right now are what we call internal loads. These are things that are plugged into outlets. It's your office equipment, your printers and things like that. So we're starting to look at more closely on how to regulate that. And then we want to make sure we have controls in place that alert you if your mechanical systems and that type of thing aren't operating correctly, to make sure you can do corrective actions to get the savings. And last but not least, we want to make sure we have something to measure the actual energy use of your building. So there's a lot involved in commercial energy efficiency. We already, some proposals passed in Albuquerque that we did not hear. They were not challenged. We have better lighting right now in the code that we had before. And so some of these things you won't have the opportunity to vote on. But that being said, you can assume that the savings, we already got the savings on it, so we're not going to worry about that. So now I just want to kind of focus on what are the big things left that you need to vote on. We'll talk about the building envelope first. When you look at the building envelope, there's two key elements we need to focus on. One is making sure, again, that the building shell is built correctly, it's insulated correctly to the levels that make sense for that. And then we also want to look, and so the first kind of category in this table are all the proposals that focus on making sure that you have the right amount of insulation in the roof assembly, your walls, your floors, your slab edge insulation, that type of thing. So all of these proposals really focus on increasing levels of insulation to ensure that your building shell is efficient. So that's the first category. The next category is once we have a good building shell for insulation, then we want to make sure that we tighten that up as much as possible to eliminate a lot of air leaks. And this is kind of the key thing. We already bring in fresh air into our buildings through our mechanical ventilation system. There's no reason to have a leaky building shell too. So there were three proposals that went in there. The first one requires mandatory air leakage testing. So you're putting a big fan on a building and pressurizing it and actually measuring how much that building leaks. That's going to be for residential, high-rise, multi-family buildings. And then there are other buildings, other commercial buildings will also be required to be tested too. And there are some exemptions on this. Every code has an exemption. There'll be some exemptions based on building size and location and that type of thing. So the CE 96 and CE 97 are basically saying you have to test most buildings, and those that are exempted that kind of fall out of the testing, you have to actually bring in someone to make sure that the building envelope is designed right, that it's sealed up properly, all of the measures are in place in your walls, roof, and floor assembly to make sure you have a tight building. So we call it envelope verification. You could also call it envelope commissioning, because you're kind of commissioning the building envelope. And this will be a key thing to making sure that our buildings don't leak. So, okay, thank you. So from an envelope standpoint, those would be the key aspects. We also need, again, I mentioned earlier about making sure that we actually kind of understand how our building is operating. So because if we understand how the building operates, we can make corrective actions to that building to tweak controls, things like that, to make sure it's operating at its peak efficiency. And so CE 111, for example, essentially basically says you have to have metering equipment. And for those of you working in above code programs, LEED and things like that, you already have metering and monitoring equipment required. This is basically just bringing it into the base energy code. You're going to have to install this too, and the code is very clear about what has to be metered. The other aspect of this will be fault detection, to make sure if your mechanical systems are failing, you know that. It'll alert you to say my economizers aren't operating correctly, or whatever part of your mechanical system isn't operating correctly. It'll alert the building operator so that they know that something's not working right and they can go up and fix it. So your system just doesn't sit up on the roof and operate inefficiently for forever without you knowing it. And then what we're finding right now is that we've done actually, we've kind of hit the main areas of the building, but the internal loads, basically your computers, your copiers, all of the, your desk lamps and everything else that are plugged in, that's getting greater and greater. And so we need to figure out a way of how do we control those loads. And so there'll be a requirement that actually will, you'll be able to plug into a wall outlet that will basically be on a timer, and it will shut off unnecessary things off your desk on a scheduled basis. It's called a controlled receptacle. And this is right now being used in cities like Seattle, for example, used quite successfully there. It's been in other national codes for a few years right now, but it really starts focusing on controlling the interior, or your internal energy use of that building. And so this will be a key critical thing that that is really important to vote for. So we go to the next slide, please. There are also a set of equipment efficiency tables for your mechanical system, your heating systems, your cooling systems, whether it be boilers or chillers or heat pumps or whatever else. And ASHRAE has a whole set of efficiency tables within their standards. And essentially CE 113 takes their efficiency tables and brings them into the IECC. So ASHRAE sets national efficiency levels on a lot of equipment type. And so this just brings us into the IECC, so it's all in one place. And it's an important proposal to get in to make sure that what's being what you're complying with is actually the where you should be. The other one, CE 140, there, when you start looking at a high-rise multifamily building, there are a lot of exhaust fans for your bathrooms and your range hoods and things like that. And currently, in a multifamily building, that can be a lot of energy use because those fans run quite a bit. So all this CE 140 does is basically puts an efficiency requirement on those exhaust fans to make sure that you are actually installing the highly efficient, basically they're Energy Star rated exhaust fans. So to make sure you're kind of getting the best exhaust fans in that you can to reduce your energy use. So CE 140 will do that. Can you go to that? Thanks. And then on CE 162, essentially, there have been requirements in the energy codes for both residential and high-rise residential that says that actually puts restrictions on the kind of light bulbs you can install. And it really says that, right now it says you need to install a compact fluorescent bulb or better because that's where the efficiency gains are. CE 162 actually now says forget compact fluorescents. Now we want you to install LED lights, and this is kind of the key thing. So, so it really pushes you toward the LED light requirements. The term we use is called efficacy, but we're not going to worry about that. It's basically how many watts of light you get out, or how many lumens of light you get out, or how many watts of power you put into this. So basically CE 162 would shift us from compact fluorescents into LED lighting, because LED is what's being sold on the market right now. So this is kind of the key critical thing to kind of move us into the current market from where we were. The last requirement that was put in was in 2009, and the market has completely shifted away from that. So we're just trying to reflect that. We can go to the next slide. So another interesting one, and especially right now, we're up here in the Pacific Northwest on the western coast, or the west part of the, actually the whole western part of the U.S. right now, where marijuana has become legalized in a lot of cases, and there are a lot of facilities right now that use a significant amount of lighting for plant growth, and that lighting is currently exempted by code, and the utilities are starting to see some major issues with the amount of power being drawn by these facilities. So CE 209 essentially says that it puts another metric into the code that we won't talk about, another metric into the code to make sure that the lighting you use to these grow houses or any agricultural use is as efficient as it can be, to make sure that actually the plants that are are using that light for growth, it won't restrict the type of plants and anything like that. The metric we put in actually will work for any grow operation, whether it be for marijuana or celery or whatever else you're growing indoors. But it sets the bar on this one, and it actually has a lot of potential energy savings. And the slide you're seeing right now actually shows how close these lights are to the plants. And so it's actually advantageous to have a light that doesn't give off a lot of heat. So because it is very close, because the heat can actually be damaging to the plants. So CE209 focuses on agricultural lighting, and again, there's a lot of energy savings on this one, and we encourage you to support this. On the residential side, on the commercial, we talked about kind of the major elements of the areas we're focused on for energy savings. And the residential is very similar. We want a really good building shell because you're only going to build your house one time, and you want them, and it's hard to go back in and retrofit from 2x4 to 2x6 walls to increase insulation and that type of thing. So the saying is you're only building the shell once, and it's because it's expensive to retrofit. We want to make sure the windows we put in the building are efficient, both from keeping the heat in, keeping the heat out during the summer months, and also we want to be able to reduce the amount of heat that comes in through that window through solar gain. We'll talk a little bit about that. We want to make sure that we eliminate any leaks in the ductwork that distribute your heating and cooling air to make sure they're getting to where they want to go. So there you've got mechanical things, you have envelope things, you've got your your windows, and then we'll talk a little bit about the energy rating index approach. But the first kind of bucket on the insulation side for insulation requirements are the top row, RE 29 through 36, and those increase insulation levels for the building envelope in multiple climate zones, up to levels that we feel are doable and practical and buildable. So those are important to make sure the building shell is actually constructed right the first time and you get the savings. The next bucket, if you will, RE 35 and 37, actually looks to make sure that the windows have the right amount of they're higher performance windows. So we measure window performance in what's called a U factor. And so you want a really good low U factor to reduce any heat from going into or out of the building. And then we also want to make sure that there's a certain amount of tint on there, if you will, to make sure we want to keep out solar gain out of the space because solar gain that enters into the building through the glass increases your cooling load, and so it drives your air conditioning load. So we want glass we can see out of, but we don't want all of the solar gain coming through that. And so that's what RE 37 will do. On the mechanical side, through the U.S. Department of Energy programs, they found out that ducts leak, your heating and cooling ducts leak. Right now, they're not required to be tested for that air leakage if they're inside the building. But the RE 112 would require any duct that's on your mechanical system to be tested to make sure it doesn't leak, so that you know that when the air leaves the furnace, it actually is going to get to the room that you're trying to heat or cool. So that'll be the key thing on that. So RE 112 is an important aspect. RE 139 actually requires that you test your ventilation systems. And this is a new one. We put in exhaust fans into our residential because our buildings are getting tighter, so we have to exhaust the air out through mechanical means. We want to make sure that those ventilation fans actually work the way they're supposed to. And so they're installed properly and they work the way they're supposed to. So there will be a requirement in the code, if this passes, to actually test them to make sure it's actually drawing the right amount of air out of that space. And then the RE7 and 148, I talked briefly about making sure that that the lights in your residential are as efficient. RE7 actually, again, takes us from a compact fluorescent light and puts us into a LED light. So RE7 is kind of the sister proposal to the one we just talked about for commercial. And that'll be the minimum bulb you can just essentially install will be an LED bulb. And RE148, we have a lot of residential scale projects that look more like commercial. They've got large parking areas for multifamily. They've got outside parking. And that exterior lighting for those areas really falls through the cracks from an enforcement standpoint. So what RE 148 does is essentially says, for projects like that where you have a lot of exterior lighting for walkways, for parking lots, use the commercial provisions of the code because it's best handled there. And that will set restrictions on how much light you can have to make sure your exterior lights are as efficient as possible. So, so that'll be the key thing. The last kind of bucket is looking at what we call the energy rating index. And essentially the home energy rating system approach has been around the US for a long time. And so people rate their houses and you get a certain score, and all the energy rating index is a HERS. It's basically HERS, but it's not called HERS, if that makes sense. So what this next bucket does is actually says, this first came into the code in 2015. There were scores set for climate zone that said this is the maximum HERS score you can get to comply with the code if you use this compliance approach. And what these requirements will do is essentially lower that score so your house becomes more efficient. And so that's really what 182, 184, and 192 in general will lower that score. It also deals with renewables and puts a cap on what percent of that score can be met by using renewables. So that'll be an important one too to kind of cap. So that's what that last bucket does. So next one. This one. Okay.
All right, electrification in codes. Why don't you continue?
I can go ahead and continue. So there's a push right now. We're calling it electrification, for lack of a better word. It's essentially moving us away from fossil fuels and ensuring that our buildings can actually use electric for heating systems, cooling systems, cooking, water heating, and clothes drying, making sure that the building is actually set up correctly to use that, because there's a trend, again, when we move away from fossil fuels, when we start adding renewables into our systems, we want to make sure we can effectively use those renewables. And so this is, and this, we're seeing this occur right now in California, and in other jurisdictions around the US right now. So there's a couple of provisions that deal strictly on the electrification side. And if we can go to the first one, we're calling this beneficial electrification because, again, it is basically saying, let's see how we can set up our houses and our multifamily to be able to effectively use electricity instead of natural gas. And so the first one, RE 126, basically encourages you to use higher energy efficiency water heating systems that still meet federal mandates and don't go above federal mandates. But it moves you toward heat pump water heaters, or if you use lower efficiency water heaters that meet federal mandates, you would need to include solar on your building. You would need to include a certain amount of photovoltaic, for example, like 1 kilowatt. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but so it's really kind of pushing us toward higher efficiency water heating. When you start looking at multifamily and realizing that the water heating load for multifamily, for example, is about roughly 40% of the load, maybe somewhere in that range, it's a pretty high percentage. So this shifts us toward higher efficiency water heaters, which will actually reduce that load, and also shifts us toward using heat pump water heaters, which is really where we need to be for electrification. So RE 126 is an important proposal to get in, especially if you're looking at trying to make best use of electric power. RE 147 is a kind of future-proofing the building, and it's essentially saying if you are bringing fossil fuels into your house, for example, you need to make sure that you can actually have electrical outlets next to your gas or propane fired equipment. So next to your furnace, next to your range, next to your water heater, and next to your dryer if it's a gas dryer. So the occupant can go ahead and, if they want to go all electric, they can, because everything will be there. And it's a lot less expensive to do it during construction than it is to do it during retrofit. So if someone wanted to retrofit later, it's going to be significant. There's a lot of expense there. If you want to do it during initial construction, this is when to do it. So that's all R47 does, is future-proofs a house to allow you to be able to cheaply convert to all electric if you want to do that. So, okay, the next one is the code is kind of getting into a new realm right now. We're starting to look at things that are not necessarily the building, but kind of the building, because these directly impact energy use in the building. And electric vehicles are becoming a major, more and more of things that we have to account for when we start looking at building, because they do use power. They do plug into both your commercial and your residential, and electric vehicles are becoming more and more on the road right now. There was one projection I saw in a city that said roughly 50% of the vehicles will be electric vehicles in the near future. So this particular proposal basically requires you to put in and install and get ready for the installation of charging stations for both the commercial code or for commercial buildings and also residential buildings. It doesn't say you have to actually install this charging station. You just have to run all the circuitry, making sure you also have space in your electrical panel and that type of thing to be able to account for it. So you can install this very cheaply. As with the electric ready proposal we just looked at, it's a lot cheaper to do to install these during construction, especially on the commercial side when you have to run it underneath your asphalt for your parking lots and that type of thing, than trying to do this after the fact when it requires you to trench. So the electric vehicle, these will be two critical proposals to get into the code that essentially will future-proof new residential and new commercial construction. So it'll be a much less expensive for them to upgrade. Let's go to the next slide. The last but not least, in the residential side, in the appendix, so this is not a requirement in the code per se, a jurisdiction would have to bring the appendix in separately after adopting the code. There's a provision in there, our Zero Energy Ready Appendix, and it essentially says that our philosophy from New Buildings Institute is we focus on efficiency first and then add renewables. We feel that's the proper way of doing it. RE 223 just does that. It makes sure that your building envelope and your building in general is as efficient as possible, and then requires you to add renewables on top of that. And we talked briefly about the energy rating index score or the HERS score, and it actually requires you to meet a very low score to get as much efficiency out of the building as you can, and then add renewables. And the way this works is a score of 0 means that you are a zero energy building, because you produce as much power for that building as you use. And so you're always so you would be required to make your building efficient and then add renewables after that efficiency gain to score 0. And so 223 will be optional if a jurisdiction wants to do that. CE 21, the last cycle, we are in Albuquerque, a proposal was put in for renewable sources, essentially, to make sure that the IECC is consistent with all of the other national standards. That went into the code. There were two elements of that definition, biomass and biogas, that were not defined. So we actually defined that in CE 21. So now we'll have a renewable definition that includes biomass and biogas. So anyone that wants to use this will know they'll be consistent from a federal standard. So this will actually work out well. So, and with that, I will pass it back to Amy.
Yeah, so we want to spend the last couple minutes of our presentation just talking about resources that are available to voters to help educate them, educate all of you more on what the proposals are. So there are 3 major products that I want to talk about, voters guides and then some resources. So the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition, or EECC, we're working with the group to put together a top proposals quick voters guide. And so this is a list of all of the proposals that EECC thinks are important, that warrant votes. The voter's guide itself is more expansive, and I'm going to show some examples. And then NBI has a fact sheet that may help answer some additional questions. Okay, so like I said, we're double checking and triple checking the votes. So the voter's guide is not yet available, but this is kind of an idea of what it's going to look like. It is a list of all the different measures, all the different proposals, what the suggested vote is. And again, you're going to either be in support or you're going to want to disapprove, and it's counterintuitive. So, and then a very short written description of what that proposal does. This is going to highlight every proposal that the IECC believes is important, and we do recommend that you vote on all of them. However, if you do have limited time, you'll notice some of these are highlighted. Some of them, that's going to direct your attention to what the group believes are the most highest priority proposals, and that if you only have a limited amount of time, those are the ones we think you should focus on. But there's a couple things about the way this is laid out. Our understanding is the way the CDP access voting works is that bouncing between residential and commercial actually is fairly time consuming, and they come up in numerical order. So this list is going to be in numerical order with residential in one list and commercial in the other. But again, if you do have limited time, please focus on those that are highlighted as priority items. So, and that's all agreed to by consensus. The IECC is made up of a broad group of stakeholders. Some of the and the voter's guide. Now, this voter's guide here is actually the one that IECC published for the public comment hearings, and I highlighted that because so this one is not the most, it won't be the one that we ask you to use for voting, but that one will be available very soon. But the technical committee includes members of the IECC, NBI, Natural Resource Defense Council, Institute Market Transformation, and others. Like I said earlier in the presentation, it really takes a collaborative effort, and this group has made a lot of efforts to work together and collaborate and achieve consensus and really deliver some outstanding proposals that we think are going to get to 10 to 15% better than the current version of the IECC. So that's the voter's guide. So we have the quick voter's guide, which is shorter, you know, one quick line about what the proposals are and how to vote. And this one provides a little bit more detail. NBI on our separately is going to publish these top proposals explained. We have heard from a number of people that want a little bit more information. They want to understand why that proposal, what the impact is it's going to be. They want to know what it's going to cost, how much it's going to save, and we have done our best to collect this information and put it together in a language that's easy for people to understand. There is a glossary at the end to explain some terms that might be a little bit more technical. But for those of you who do want to know more about the top proposals, we will have a subset of the proposals that are on the IECC Voters Guide. So it's not going to be all of them, but we are putting this out as best we can to get information to all of you who want to know more. And I also want to direct you to a couple important websites for more information. NBI does have a landing page, our 2021 IECC base codes page. That's a place that you can get information. We'll have all the voters guides. We'll have the quick voters guide up there. We'll have fact sheets and our top proposals explained. There are also blog posts. If you're interested in more technical explanations of some of the proposals that we talked about today, we have past webinars that have been recorded, and you can get into the weeds if you want to in some of those. The EECC, the energyefficientcodes.org, is another outstanding resource for people. They have, EECC has done a great job organizing a variety of resources. You can find things like the U.S. Conference of Mayors resolution. I don't know if you know, but at their annual meeting last June, unanimously passed a resolution to support a strong IECC 2021 and to direct mayors and their staff to use the EECC voting guide. So EECC has great resources that are available on their site as well. Also, we'll direct you to the ICC site, iccsafe.org. That's where you're going to go log in and get your password and username all squared away in advance of voting beginning. You can go there to change your password, to get your PIN number, and make sure you're ready when time comes, when they do open the voting, whether that happens November 13th or the 18th. But get prepared, and then as we do encourage jurisdictions to host a party or a lunch session, maybe get some pizza and have everybody sit down, and you can talk about some of the key proposals and support each other, because like I said, it is not necessarily the most intuitive system. And CDB Access, that is the system, that's where the voting will take place. We've heard that ICC is going to have their own webinar, maybe to explain how to do some of this voting. Again, look to the ICC website for that. That is kind of the latest that we've heard, but it hasn't been published on their site yet. And I think that's it. So thank you for your attention and for voting in the 2021 IECC update. There are a lot of important reasons why to do this, and many of you are in a unique position to really make a huge difference in buildings and health and well-being of the people that are in them. So with that, I wonder if we have any questions.
We do have some questions, Amy. I'm going to start out with some of the process questions, which we were trying to focus on today. Do you get the PIN after you log in to check your password and log in? Do you get your PIN after you log in to check your password?
The way I understand it, so you know, I'm saying this as someone who is not a validated voter, but my best understanding is that you log into my ICC at that, I'm going to go back one slide. See, at that ICC website, iccsafe.org. When you go in there, you're going to check every voter rep has their own password. And then you go and you choose my information, which I understand is on the left side of the screen. And then there's the change my password screen. And that's the place that you can check your password, make sure you're all set, and then you can update your PIN, and they're also going to want your date of birth. And both of those are necessary. They're the necessary security questions for the voting process. So the tip that ICC has on their website is that the username for CDB Access is your email address. So if that helps provide a start, that will at least get you started so that you can begin that login and to get your PIN number. And then, like I said, if we do hear that ICC is scheduling that webinar, we'll put out a quick blog or a promotional email to folks to make sure that they know about it.
Okay, the next question, can you start voting one day, save your progress, and return to it another day?
That is a very good question. And unfortunately, I am not going to know the answer to that one. I'm sorry to say, but I'm going to have to defer that one because I really want to be careful not to give incorrect information. The other stuff I downloaded right from the ICC website in preparation for the question, but this one I'm sorry I can't answer. So we can try to find out, and so all the questions are getting logged, we can find out and try to follow up.
We did have somebody who must be an experienced voter in this place said that, yes, you can vote over several days.
All right, thank
Great.
you.
Good.
It's a group effort, like I said, a collaborative effort.
And there was another comment that came in that in that process, you can also go back and change your votes. So hopefully that covers it. All right, the next question we have is, this is more about the language that we're using here. With the CDP Access voting slide that you had up, should this slide say support or oppose as opposed to disapproved?
We will clarify that because it gets a little confusing, because sometimes you want to disapprove the committee vote. It's when the voting guide comes out, that will all be clarified because it's a great question, and in some cases you want to support the committee, in some cases you want to disapprove the committee. So that will be clarified in the voting guide, so you'll know exactly what to vote on. So great question though, because it's not straightforward.
Okay, now we are going to some questions about the voter's guide. We have questions both about when to expect the voter's guide, and that in our webinar today that we were mentioning specific proposals to support. Is there going to be a voter's guide that is more comprehensive with the list of proposals to both vote for or against?
Good question. Okay, I'm going to bounce back here. So this voter's guide, the quick voter's guide, is kind of the short description. It will tell you for and against, so or support or disapprove, however it is. So this will tell you both directions, both ways to vote on all of these proposals. All right, the IECC Voters Guide. All right, so the first one was called the Quick Voters Guide. This one is just the Voters Guide, and it is more comprehensive. So this is going to explain more about the proposals and the process that has happened along the way and where it's ended up and what IECC's position is on it. That is, so that will give you a little bit more information, and it will be for or against. Now this one is the hearing version. So there were 3 options at the hearings, but that's not going to be the case moving forward. So I circled that because I wanted to be very clear that it's not going to be the exact thing, but something like that. And then the top proposals explained, like I said, is going to be exactly consistent with the Quick Voters Guide. It's just going to give you a little bit more information, maybe, try to explain a little bit about why this is this proposal is a good idea, and what it's going to achieve.
Okay. For our participants today that aren't very familiar with those points tables, this question, for the commercial code points tables, what quantity exactly are the point values representing?
So I can answer that. Each point is equal to 0.25% savings. So basically 1/4% savings. So that the points option, the new table would require you to get 10 points or 10 credits. And so you're looking at 2.5% additional savings on those tables.
Okay.
Yeah, so and then the other thing is, that's 218, but the important thing is that it kind of provides that structure. It provides that mechanism in the code. And that's why CE 218 and RE 209 are so important, because it provides that underlying structure. And and the savings on the commercial side is 2.5% overall, and on the residential side is 5%. So those two we highlighted because we think they're really important.
Yeah, because if a jurisdiction wants to adopt the code and get more savings, they can require 20 points, for example, on the commercial. So then you'd get an additional, instead of 2.5% savings more, you'd get 5% savings. So that table allows a jurisdiction to have a lot of flexibility on how many people want to require. So it's an important platform to get into the code.
And then it's also easy to add new options,
Exactly,
right?
yeah.
So, and that's the thing, because like as we've seen, this process is pretty comprehensive. And so what we'll be able to do is use that structure and say, oh, hey, this is another option, because it may not get savings everywhere for every building. So that's why we think the flex points and the points options are so important.
Okay, how many voters are necessary to achieve the 10% savings we're looking for?
Good question. So the how many voters is, well, let me see if I could take a step back and try to explain it. The goal of this cycle is, like I said, 10%. We may be able to get to 15, but 10% savings. And it would be kind of all of these proposals wrapped into together are what fundamentally ends up achieving. I mean, how all that is determined is another technical webinar in and of itself, but it would be kind of the bundle proposals. Like I said, we will focus attention on the quick voters guide to ones we think are the highest priority. But if IECC has taken a position on it, we think it's pretty important. So, those, we understand everyone is really busy. And you may only be able to focus on the high priority ones. Those are the ones that we're really aiming for to help get some savings. So it would be all that. Now, as far as the numbers of voters, that's almost like a separate question, right? Because we have what proposals are going to get us to the 10%. But then each proposal is going to require a certain number of voters in order to get it passed, right? And it really depends on what happened at the committee. All right, so what Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is if it's in support of what the committee does, it's just a majority. But if you want to overturn the last action, whatever happened at the committee, it would take a 2/3 vote of the number of people that voted. All right, so I hope I've clarified that the percent savings that we're trying to achieve is kind of a function of all the proposals working together, whereas on any individual proposals, the number of voters depend on whether you're agreeing with the committee or not agreeing with the committee.
But I think the important thing is it takes everyone's vote. So yeah, that's going to be the key thing, is the votes are important on all of these. Whether it be a simple majority or 2/3, they're all very, very critical. So.
All right, let's see here. So back to some of the process questions. Somebody asked with the note that the pizza party is, they heard the pizza party was a good idea. How long will it take a team to vote?
Yes, so we were talking about that yesterday, actually. It's a really good question. So to some extent, experienced voters will fly through it and they will have no problem. There is probably going to be a learning curve for those who are unfamiliar with voting. And so we are aiming for the priority proposals that that are noted on the quick guide to take about an hour. So that's our goal, is to provide voters with a priority list of proposals that they can do in an hour. The list is going to be quite a bit longer than that. and we understand that. We think, though, that once you get into the groove, it's going to go a lot faster, and we're purposefully laying it out in numeric order and not bouncing between residential and commercial to help facilitate that so that you can maximize your time voting. And then other things like getting your PIN and your password and your new username, getting all that dealt with up front, we think is useful. So I'm optimistic to hear that ICC is going to have a website to help teach people how to vote. There is another video that's out there right now, but honestly, I watched it and it didn't make it necessarily much more clear for me. So, I mean, we can post it, but I'd put it out there with like a caveat that it doesn't make things crystal clear. It does show how the system works, though. So, but we're hopeful that they have a webinar. It may not have the webinar until after voting opens. So if that helps you determine when to schedule your pizza party, you might schedule it for a little bit later in the voting process as opposed on the first day. But I wouldn't necessarily wait till the last day either. In case you do run into any troubles, you really want to make sure you get your vote done. So, and what we've learned today is that you can save some of that and then go back.
Yeah.
Okay, before I ask another question, I did want to address, we've had quite a few people ask about the recording and the slides for this session, and indeed we will be sending that out to everybody who registered for this session tomorrow at about 11 o'clock. So that answers a few of your questions that have come in.
Yeah, let me say that once we get the quick voters guide and we can direct people to the longer voters guide and the other resources that we mentioned, we'll send that in email as well to all of you since you've expressed interest. So yes, you'll get a recording and the slides, and then as soon as the other things become published, we will get those out to you as well. So you don't have to go searching for them.
Okay, will the quick voting guide have the same recommendations for how to vote as the more detailed IECC guide?
Yes, yes, all three will be aligned.
Okay.
And that's a testament actually to this group and kind of a lot of collaboration that's going on. So a lot of work went into that. So we're excited.
And we did have another question. I know that you mentioned that the tentative dates may have changed at this point. Somebody has asked, when can we start voting?
Okay, so way back when, the dates were scheduled as November 13th through the 27th. But the latest that we've heard, I looked yesterday and I did not see the new dates published. We have heard it might not start till November 18th. And then, in case anyone's checking, that kind of falls into a holiday week. And so we're not exactly sure how that will address the break that many of us have. So, so stay tuned, but November 18th is kind of the latest that we've heard, but not been published yet.
Okay, as we're talking about, we're using the word savings, is this price or energy or carbon that we're talking about savings?
Oh, good question. So when you submit a proposal into this process, you have to give some indication of savings. Typically, it's energy. But people do different things. Sometimes they do cost, sometimes they do price or energy. Carbon has not really come into this, but there obviously are a couple of proposals here that are on the electrification side that are more focused on carbon. I know that IECC is actually coming up with carbon savings on their, as they're looking at the proposals to kind of say, if you vote for all these, this is what your carbon savings will be. So I know they're working on that side. So it really kind of varies based on what you're, based on the provision, on the proposal, and that type of thing. So, but typically traditionally it's been on energy. You know, those are the numbers you get. But that's starting to kind of move in a different direction right now. So.
Mm-hmm. And on that top proposals explained fact sheet that I mentioned, one of the, if I go back one of the columns there is estimated energy savings.
Mm-hmm.
So we, we basically have pulled information from some of those proposals themselves and other research that we know about.
Yeah.
Okay. So this question, do you vote on the IECC or the ICC website or CDP website?
Good question. All right, ICC is where you get your login and password and PIN number, but the voting actually happens on the CDP Access
Which
site.
is like a sub, you log into CDP Access from ICCSafe.org. So it's all nested in there. So
Okay.
I've never done the voting, but I know the way that CDP Access is structured right now is that's where you submit your proposals and your public comments and everything else. So it's all tied together underneath the ICCSafe.org. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so you're going to go out there to access it.
Yeah, it's like a big database.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I know that we are not doing this in this webinar, but you did mention a resource on the CDP Access website. Somebody said that they've logged in once and found the platform very confusing.
Yes, from everything we've understood, it is not the most intuitive website to use. Mm-hmm. So we've never voted, so we don't know how that works. We've only been on the proposal submittal side of the whole thing, and that can be a little bit confusing. I suspect it is. So, and hopefully if the webinars that ICC is talking about doing come out, it'll eliminate the confusion, but we're trying to collect as much information right now and get the information out right now to get rid of confusion as possible.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I know that we have some, NBI has been directing people to some really outstanding work that's been going on in Massachusetts. The Boston City Council members there have been doing little tutorial videos about how to log in and how to validate your voters. And so we're hopeful that they're going to do one about the voting when it comes out. So there may be multiple resources to help. But yes, I would agree that it is confusing. I would say that from our internal perspective, our philosophy is don't wait till the last minute to do it. And so we try to make sure that when we're doing proposals, we do them ahead of time, ahead of the deadline, just in case we do get backed up or have some sort of a technical difficulty. The other thing is doing it as a group so that you can kind of help each other through it. It's sometimes easier to have people around to bounce ideas off of and share lessons learned so that you don't get stuck.
Okay. So we have a question on that early modeled energy code performance graph that you shared in the presentation. Do the plotted IECC points represent the commercial or residential provisions of the code?
All right, so I'm gonna, sorry to make you dizzy here. I'm gonna bounce back to that. Sorry, I didn't realize it was so far back. Okay, so each of these dots is basically what's called a determination, and that is an energy modeling analysis that's done by Pacific Northwest National Labs. So for those of you who might not be familiar, PNNL is one of the US's Department of Energy's national labs. They do all the energy modeling and they model the codes to see how much energy they use. And basically, it's a pretty complicated process, but they do a modeling across a lot of building types in all the climate zones, and then they create what are basically weighted averages, which determine the energy use of that particular code. So these dots are actually determination outputs, and the last few dots, the 2018 IECC and the 2019 ASHRAE, my technical staff actually gave me this chart with those colored differently originally because they're estimates right now. The other ones have all had their determination. Those ones are estimates of what the determination would be. And then this dot was actually just saying, okay, if we got 10%, what would that look like? So, so I may have, added information there that wasn't determined by PNNL, but that's what this data is based on.
But these, what we're looking at now are on the commercial side.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, so it's what the 2021 commercial IECC would be if everything we think is going to go through goes through. So and the information we're getting right now, people have been doing just kind of ballpark estimates that said they think the 2021 will be right the same, but actually not even a little more efficient than the 2019 ASHRAE standard, which would be kind of neat. So that's what the commercial, this is a commercial trajectory. I haven't seen a residential trajectory, but it's kind of on the same line as would be with the IECC, the orange dots, if you will. So it'd be roughly similar to that.
Okay, and we have a question about how our little municipal governments will achieve their ambitious goals without greening existing building stock while they're working on very strict codes for new buildings. Can you address that?
So right now we have Chapter 5 of the IECC, which it just kind of directs you back into the main body of the code if you do an addition or alteration. I think that the 900-pound gorilla right now we're looking at is existing buildings and how best to deal with that. And I think the energy code itself doesn't do a good job of actually pushing people toward increasing efficiency for existing buildings. So that is almost going to have to be a separate effort, if you will, I think, to say, and there are jurisdictions that are currently trying to figure that out as far as how to actually get existing buildings to be more efficient through the building energy performance standards and benchmarking and things like that. So the energy code, as you're looking at it right now, is really for new construction. Chapter 5 does deal with existing to try to say if you do anything, at least you have to bring it up to the standards. But the tricky part is how do you get someone to do something? That's the hard one to crack right there. So that gets into actually ordinances within the city itself to require these types of changes. So it's just something that the IECC is working on it, but again, it's a consensus-based process, and it probably doesn't force someone to do something, and that's kind of the key thing. So that's what we face right now is how do you actually entice someone or get someone to do it or require someone to do it. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the other thing we talk about sometimes at NBI are what are the opportunities over a building's life cycle where you can really influence the energy consumption. And, there are certain points in the building's life cycle, like when new construction happens or when a major renovation happens. So I mean, at the very least, energy codes hit those two very important points. And but that is not to, I mean, we don't disagree at all. The existing building performance when there's no action happening that would trigger code are another problem. And like Eric said, there are a number of jurisdictions that are starting to grapple with that, and that's a pretty exciting area of work as well.
Okay, and I think that's it. We've had a couple questions trickle in about those voter guides and their availability. And that seems to be the end.
Yeah, so we're aiming to try to get those all laid out and finalize the votes. Like I said, we want to be crystal clear and make sure we're given all the right, support and disapprove and have all that language all perfect before we get those out. We're aiming to get that done by Friday. It may be that some of you on the East Coast find this on Monday, but we are working with the entire IECC group to finalize those guides and get those published. And we will be sure to get it out to you. You wouldn't need it until the 18th, but we are trying to get it to you sooner, as soon as we possibly can. I know that there were some exhausted people after the hearings last week. So people have been regrouping this week and trying to verify exactly what happened and make sure that we're leading folks in the right direction. So I guess with that, we want to just thank all of you for participating and for your really good questions, and especially encourage you to vote in the upcoming voting whenever it begins. Feel free to email us or contact us directly if you have other questions. And we will put out the word whenever we have the voter's guide or when we hear about the ICC webinar, if they get that up and posted. So thank you all so much. We hope you have a wonderful day, and let us know if you have questions.